Imagine it's winter in the 14th century. There's no electricity, no central heating, no glass in your windows, no mattress, just wind and silence. And maybe, if you're lucky, the breath of something warm nearby. Outside, frost bites at the edges of the village. The sun has disappeared behind thick clouds before supper, and now the world is black, moonless, windswept, utterly quiet except for the groaning of the wood, the crackle of straw, and the howl of wolves far beyond the tree line. You are a peasant, and your only goal tonight? Don't die. Your home is a one-room hut, made of wattle and daub, a mixture of mud, straw, and sticks. Your roof is thatched, thick with rot and moss. There are no windows, only holes patched with cloth. The door is thin wood, often crooked. Cold air sneaks in, it always does. The floor is dirt. There is no chimney, just a hole in the roof where smoke sometimes finds its way out. Sometimes, mostly, it just sits in the air, coating your lungs, blackening the beams above. You cough. It's normal. Everyone coughs. There is a fire in the middle of the room. It rests on a pile of stones blackened from years of use. It burns peat or animal dung. Wood is too expensive for people like you. The fire is your only source of light, but it's small, weak, and it must be fed often to survive the night, but fuel is scarce, so you let it die long before the cold does. You bundle close to the embers, hoping they last just a bit longer. They don't. You are wearing all your clothes, a woolen tunic patched and worn. Under it, a linen shirt, thin, scratchy, woolen hose, thigh-high, tied with a bit of rope, a cloak, if you're lucky, maybe a hood pulled low over your face, no underwear, no socks. Your boots, if you have any, are damp, and by the door you won't take off your clothes to sleep, because once you lose the heat in them, you won't get it back. There's no real bed. Maybe a wooden frame if your family's lucky, but most sleep on a pile of straw, matted down by years of use. The straw stinks of sweat, mold, animals. You spread an old blanket across it, or a sack, or just your cloak. There are no pillows. Your head rests on your arm, or your bundled-up tunic. Sometimes the straw crawls, fleas, lice, itches that never end. But you sleep anyway because there is no alternative. You don't sleep alone. Your entire family shares this straw. Mother, father, siblings, babies, grandparents, maybe even neighbors if they were left homeless by fire, illness, or rent. You lie side by side, pressed against each other, because in winter, body heat is currency. You sleep in a tangle of limbs. No one complains. If a baby cries, it's muffled quickly. You don't want to wake the others if someone dies in the night. It happens quietly. By morning, the body is cold. You move them aside and carry on. No matter how many bodies surround you, the cold finds a way in. It creeps through the floor. It drips from the roof. It rides the breath of the wind through the wall cracks. There is no such thing as true warmth. Only less cold. You sleep curled into yourself, arms wrapped tight, knees pulled close. Your breath fogs in the air, visible in the dark. You dream of fire. You dream of summer. You dream of food you no longer have. And sometimes, you don't wake up. Across the hut, in the same room, your animals sleep. The cow, the goat, the chicken, sometimes even the pig. They don't smell good, but they give off heat. And in this season, that heat can be the difference between life and death. You hear them shift, snort, scratch. You pray they stay healthy, because if they die, you don't just lose warmth. You lose milk, you lose eggs, You lose the ability to survive the next day, so you thank them silently and pull your cloak tighter. Midnight. There are no clocks, but you feel it. A hollow stillness settles over everything. Even the wind seems to pause. The fire is gone. The room is dark, entirely dark. You can't see your own hand. You can only hear breathing, heavy, slow shared. You wonder if it will snow tonight. You wonder if the wolves have come closer. You wonder if tomorrow will be better. Then you stop wondering and fall asleep. You think the night is silent, but it isn't. Not really. You hear the quiet stirrings of life, even in the coldest dark. A chicken shifts in its perch. The cow sighs, steam rising from its nostrils. A child murmurs in their sleep, chasing something in their dreams. Outside, the thatched roof rustles with wind. A dog barks far off, then silence again. Then, a cracking noise. A footstep? No, just the wood groaning as it freezes still. You pull the blanket tighter, just in case. Smell is never absent in the Middle Ages. Even the cold can't wash it away. Tonight, your nostrils are filled with old smoke from peat or dung, damp straw, sweat unwashed for weeks, the sourness of feet and wool and breath, cow dung from the far corner, mold, always mold. You've lived in this odor your entire life. You don't notice it anymore, but it clings to you like your own shadow. In summer it chokes, in winter it settles, still, always there. Your skin crawls, fleas, lice, bedbugs. Everyone has them. You've tried everything, herbs, ash, vinegar, nothing works. You scratch until your skin bleeds, then stop, then scratch again. You try not to move too much in the straw. It wakes others and disturbs the animals. Besides, the more you move, the colder it gets, so you stay still, scratching in silence, until sleep returns. A few hours pass. It's colder now. Colder than before. The fire is dead, the air is frozen, your cloak is stiff from your own breath. Someone coughs beside you. It echoes like thunder. Another groans, a baby whimpers. You turn on your side and feel cold against your back, where body heat doesn't reach. You press yourself closer to the warmth. It helps, a little. Not much, but enough. You begin to dream. Not vividly, not brightly, but hazy. You dream of sunlight, of bread fresh from a warm oven, of rivers not frozen, of your mother's voice when she was young. You dream of things you've never had, of baths, of linen sheets, of rooms where windows have glass. They blur and shift. You wake up suddenly. You're cold again. You curl deeper into yourself. You try to remember the dream, but it's already gone. Sometimes someone wakes in the night. They stir, they moan, they whisper a prayer, they sit up, shivering. They try to rebuild the fire, but the peat is gone. The wood is wet. The embers are cold, so they give up. They urinate in a bucket, maybe drink a bit of water, then crawl back to the straw and whisper, "Lord, have mercy." You hear it, but you say nothing. You're too tired to join the prayer, too cold to open your mouth. There's a fear no one speaks aloud, but it's there. Every winter night it waits in the corner like a shadow. What if I don't wake up? What if the cold reaches deeper? What if your heart slows too far? What if no one notices until morning? Sometimes people die this way, quietly, painlessly, frozen. The others find them cold, stiff, eyes closed, as if still dreaming. And when it happens, there's no panic, no outcry, just a gentle pulling away, a silent prayer, and then breakfast. Eventually, you begin to sense the shift. The air smells different, the darkness softens, faint silver where the roof leaks. Someone stirs, a child whimpers, the cow snorts and stands. The rooster doesn't crow. It's too cold. But the day has come anyway. You survived. There's frost on the walls. You can see your own breath. Your legs ache from staying curled all night. Your mouth is dry. You're hungry. You're alive. You push yourself up from the straw. Your body is stiff. Your hands tremble. You look around. A sleeping sibling, a snoring father, a mother already moving near the door, the cow watching you calmly. No one says it aloud, but they all think it. Another night down. Your mother starts the fire again. She blows gently on the ashes, adds a handful of dried dung, a few broken twigs. Smoke fills the hut again. You cough, you wince, but you smile, because you're cold and the fire is coming back. And in the Middle Ages, that's enough to call it a good morning. This was one night, only one, and yet it was everything. It was survival, it was family, it was fear, it was warmth, found not in flame but in presence. A medieval peasant didn't sleep to escape. They slept to continue, to persist, to endure, and tonight so do you. Close your eyes. Breathe slow, the fire will return. It always does. In the modern world, going to bed is a small ritual. You brush your teeth, you pull on a soft cotton shirt, you fluff your pillow and turn off the lights. But for a medieval peasant, there were no pajamas, no slippers, no flannel sheets, no heated blankets. There was only what you already had, and that was never enough. Undressing was a luxury, one reserved for lords, for noblewomen, for people with privacy. Peasants had no such thing. Their homes were small, their families were large. There was no bedroom, just the bed. No changing room, just the corner near the animals. And so they slept in their clothes, the same clothes they wore to work the fields, the same clothes they wore in the rain, in the mud, to funerals, to church, dirt and all. Wool. If there is one fabric that defines medieval life, it's this one. It was cheap, local, durable, warm when dry. Every peasant wore wool, sometimes layered, sometimes patched, often passed down. Your outer tunic was wool, your hose, thick leggings tied around the thighs, were wool. Your cloak, if you owned one, was heavy, smelly, itchy wool. It wasn't soft, it wasn't pretty, but it saved lives, especially on cold nights. Let's walk through what a medieval peasant might wear to bed, layer by layer. 1. Linen undershirt, if lucky, a rare luxury worn by men and women, soft at first but over time, stiff yellowed, patched. 2. Woolen tunic, thick, usually brown or gray, belted at the waist with a rope or leather strip. 3. Wool hose, covering each leg separately, tied at the waist. No elastic, no comfort, but better than frostbite. 4. Surcoat or overdress for women. A second layer of wool, often sleeveless. Heavy, functional. 5. Woolen cloak or mantle thrown over everything at night, used as both clothing and blanket. 6. Hood or coif, headwear mattered, Heat escapes from the scalp and they knew it. A wool or linen hood could keep you alive until morning. They slept in it all, every stitch, because taking off your clothes at night was an invitation to death. Think about it. You've spent the entire day working in the cold. Your clothes are damp. Your skin is raw. Your body is shivering. Now imagine stripping down and crawling into straw, no heating, no mattress, no barrier between you and the night air. No, you keep your clothes on even if they're damp, even if they itch, even if you smell like smoke and animals, because heat is life, and clothes are the last defense. If you look at medieval manuscripts closely, you'll notice something odd. People are always wearing hoods, even in bed. Why? Because they worked. A sleeping hood, also called a nightcap or coif, wasn't about fashion. It was about survival. It kept heat from escaping. It shielded the ears from drafts. It covered lice-infested hair. It could even hide the sound of your teeth chattering. For children, the hood was tied under the chin. For adults, it was often just draped and tucked around the shoulders. Some were wool, others were linen, none were clean, but all were necessary. Let's step outside the peasant hut for just a moment. In the manor house down the road, the nobility lived differently. They had bedclothes, soft linen gowns, silk-lined robes, fox fur slippers, feather-stuffed pillows, servants to warm their beds with stones wrapped in cloth. And yes, even nightshirts tailored for comfort. But that was a different world, one the peasant only saw from far away, if ever. Back in the hut, the only warmth came from what you already owned, which wasn't much. When you sleep in your clothes every night, they begin to change. They soak in your sweat. They trap the smoke from the fire. They hold the scent of livestock, dung, and decay. There was no soap, no running water, no laundry machine humming in the next room. Clothes were cleaned maybe once a season, in a stream, beaten with stones, hung to dry on bushes, and then worn again, and again, and again, until they rotted, or fell apart, or were passed down to a younger sibling. Children didn't get special treatment. If anything, they had it worse. Most wore a single wool tunic, oversized, shapeless, belted with a cord, no shoes, no undergarments, often no cloak. They shivered beside their parents. Sometimes slept beside livestock. Their skin was red from windburn, their lips cracked, their fingers raw, but no one complained. That was life. And life meant layers, even for a child. Every peasant knew. Sleep was not rest. Sleep was survival. And what you wore to bed could mean the difference between waking up or not. It often rained, and when it didn't rain, it snowed, or the wind cut sideways across the hills, or the mist clung to everything like damp breath. And your clothes, your only clothes, got wet. There was no change of outfit, no spare cloak waiting on a hook. You simply wore what you had, wet or not. You tried to dry them near the fire, but the fire was small. The room was crowded. The smoke made your eyes water. So you slipped into bed with damp sleeves, soaked hems, a tunic heavy with cold, and you hoped your own body heat would dry it. Sometimes it did, sometimes it didn't. And sometimes your body just got colder. Until it stopped. The nobility slept in light linens, but a peasant, they never stripped before sleep. Why? Because getting undressed made you vulnerable. vulnerable to the cold, sudden danger, fires, bandits, wolves, illness, shame. If the hut caught fire, you needed to run immediately. No time to dress. If your neighbor pounded on the door, "They've come for us." You ran. You ran in your boots, your belt, your cloak. You didn't pause to look proper. You paused and you died, so you slept fully dressed. Even if you itched, even if you stank, even if the straw made your legs bleed, because the night was always watching. Clothes had meaning. They weren't just protection. They were belief. They were ritual. They were sacred. Some peasants stitched charms into their cloaks. Bits of thread in the shape of crosses, stars, ancient signs, to ward off nightmares, ghosts, witch breath, believed to cause sleep paralysis. The black dog that sat on your chest. Others whispered prayers while dressing for bed. They pulled their hood tight, crossed themselves, tied their belt thrice, left to right, and always slept with their feet facing the hearth, so their soul could find its way back if it left in the night. Clothes weren't cheap. A single wool tunic could cost a month's wages, a pair of boots more than a pig, which meant people stole them, even in the dead of night, even from your own home, even from someone asleep. There are stories of a man waking naked in his straw, robbed by his cousin, of a woman whose only cloak was taken while she dreamed, of a child whose shoes vanished in the dark in the coldest seasons. Clothes were life, so you guarded them, you wore them even in sleep, because hanging them nearby meant losing them. By now your clothes are layered in weeks of sweat, dampened by fog, blackened by soot, rubbed raw by straw, and yet you keep wearing them, because the alternative is freezing. Sometimes your own smell wakes you, a sourness, a heaviness, the scent of wool soaked in everything wrong. You shift in the dark, you itch. You wonder when you last washed anything. You forget, because it doesn't matter. You'll sleep anyway. What other choice do you have, despite it all? Wool still protects you. It itches. It weighs, it chafes, but it holds heat. It clings to warmth like memory. And in the absence of a fire, a cloak wrapped twice can save you. Some peasants stitched fur along the edges. Others lined theirs with rags or moss. Some wore sacks over their tunics. Any added layer would do. And they passed this knowledge down. Wool in the cold, linen in the heat, leather for the wind, bare skin for no one. You didn't look special. No one did. Every peasant wore brown, gray, and off-white, mud-stained green. There was no fashion, no trends, only repetition. Clothes were patched endlessly, handed down, resized, reused. A tunic worn by a grandfather became bedding for a grandchild. A hood that saw the Black Death was still worn 3 decades later. Nothing was wasted because everything had to survive. Just like the people who wore it. Before closing your eyes, you check that your cloak is tight, that your hood covers your ears, that your belt hasn't come loose, that your feet aren't too close to the wall, where the frost gathers. Then you breathe slowly, you curl into the dark, you let the weight of wool press you down, and you hope it's enough. In the middle of the night, there is no nobility, there is no wealth, there is no rank, there are only shapes. Huddled in the straw, breathing softly, covered in layers of wool and time. Whether you're a child or a grandmother, whether you're a thief or a priest, You sleep wrapped in the same shivering swoons, and dream of the same warmth that may or may not come. You can learn a lot from what people wore to bed. You can learn what they feared, what they lacked, what they valued. You can see their love in the way a mother tucked her child's hood, their grief in the patched cloak of a man whose wife died last winter, their hope in the way they held on night after night, even when the cold said no more. So next time you pull on a clean shirt and slide between cotton sheets, remember the peasants and their wool, and the night that never gave them rest, only survival. The sun has vanished. The fields lie still. Tools are stacked at the door. The cow is tethered. The chickens have nestled into the rafters. Inside the one-room hut, the peasant family gathers, not for a feast, but for something warm, anything to take the edge off the cold before sleep. Because in the Middle Ages, food wasn't about pleasure. It was about survival. There were no stoves, no ovens, no kitchens, just a fire pit, often in the center of the room, ringed with blackened stones. Sometimes it smoked, sometimes it flared too high, sometimes it died. But it was all they had. A single iron pot hung over the flames, swinging slightly from a hook. This pot cooked everything: morning porridge, midday gruel, evening stew, herbal teas, bath water for babies, linen rags when wounds needed boiling. It was never truly clean, but it worked, and tonight it holds dinner. If there was food to be had, it was usually stew. Thickened water, barley, turnips, leeks, maybe a bit of old onion. And if fortune smiled, a bone. Not meat, just the bone. Left over from Sunday's pottage, boiled again until it gave up the last of its marrow. The stew simmers slowly. Its smell is thin, not savory, not sweet, but it promises heat, and that is enough. Plates were rare, bowls rarer. Many families had a single wooden bowl passed from hand to hand, and one spoon. It moved from child to mother to grandfather. Each person took a turn, quick but quiet, grateful. Slurping was not rude, it was necessary. If you dropped the spoon, you wiped it. If you dropped it into the pot, you fished it out. Cleanliness wasn't the goal, efficiency was. Every meal came with bread, but not the soft, fluffy kind you know. Medieval bread was dense, hard, coarse, often stale. Made from rye, barley, or maslin, a mix of grains grown by necessity, not preference. It was baked once a week, left to sit in a linen sack, eaten slowly, piece by piece, until it went moldy, and then it was eaten anyway, sometimes dipped in stew, sometimes softened in beer, sometimes gnawed like leather. There's a reason peasants had few teeth. This bread is it. But sometime, even bread was gone. The stores were empty, the harvest was poor, the rats were bold, the Lord demanded more than usual, and so dinner was just hot water with weeds, dock leaf, nettle, wild garlic if you were lucky. They called it green broth. But it had little broth, and less green, still. It was warm, and in a winter night that meant something. The children were thirsty, but no one drank water. Not in the Middle Ages. Water was risky, tainted, shared with animals, sometimes filled with rot. Instead, They drank small beer, yes, even the children. It was low in alcohol, brewed at home, mildly bitter, slightly nutritious. It didn't make you drunk, but it didn't make you sick. That was enough. So the child drank and wiped their lips and smiled, a little warmth, a little weight in the belly, enough to sleep. Some families had beans, dried, soaked, boiled, mashed, sometimes flavored with salt if you had some, or garlic if it wasn't already gone, or bacon fat if it had been a festival. Beans were filling. They sat heavy in the stomach. They slowed the body. They made you tired. That was good because sleep came easier when you were full, even if full just meant slightly less empty. Dinner was not loud. There was no laughter, no long conversation, no clatter of dishes, just slurping and chewing, and the soft, slow cracking of stale bread, sometimes a prayer, sometimes a yawn, sometimes a child asked, "Will we have more tomorrow?" And a parent would answer, "We'll see," which meant no, but also meant maybe, and always meant sleep and don't worry. It was hope. It was memory. It was warmth. A spoon of gruel reminded you that you'd lived another day. A crust of bread meant you might live one more. Food wasn't comfort. It was strategy. It was survival. It was routine. And as the pot emptied, the family settled. Bellies not full, but not entirely hollow. It would have to be enough. Some nights. There was no stew, no bread, no beans, no beer, only water fetched from the stream, muddy and cold, or the last bit of hay tea steeped from cattle feed. The children cried. The adults were silent. You didn't speak when your belly was empty. You listened to the wind, the fire, the growl inside you. And then you went to sleep, because dreaming was the only meal left. Sometimes someone was ill, a cough that wouldn't stop, a fever that stayed through the frost, a baby too weak to cry. That night a special soup was made, garlic, onion, wild herbs, a pinch of salt if there was any, boiled into a thin broth, strained through cloth, fed with a wooden spoon, one drop at a time. They called it healing water. It wasn't strong, it wasn't magic, but it was warm, and warm meant everything. Pepper was rare, cinnamon was legend, nutmeg unthinkable. To most peasants, spices were as real as dragons. But sometimes, just sometimes, your father came home from the market with a tiny pouch. Inside, mustard seeds, sharp, cheap, enough to flavor a week's worth of soup. It was crushed with a stone, mixed into a barley stew, shared carefully, silently, like treasure. That one taste of heat on your tongue, it made you feel rich, just for a moment. After a feast day, Easter perhaps, or St. Martin's, there might be leftovers, boiled eggs, bits of roasted meat, cakes made from oats and honey, but you didn't eat it all at once. You saved some for the dark nights, wrapped it in cloth, hid it under straw, shared it when the wind howled too loud. It wasn't just food, it was a story, proof that something good had happened once, and might happen again. Before bed, some drank herbal infusions, chamomile, nettle, heather, yarrow, elderflower. Each had a purpose. This one for dreams, this one for pain, this one for love lost. There were no mugs, just wooden cups or hollowed-out horns. Children were given warm milk if the cow had given enough. Adults, sometimes wine, more often ale sop. Bread soaked in beer, soft like pudding, eaten with a spoon. It stuck to your ribs, made your eyelids heavy. That was the goal. Food and faith were never far apart. Some families crossed themselves before eating. Others spoke aloud, "Bless this bread, bless the hand that baked it, bless us that we wake tomorrow." Some placed a crust on the hearth. "For the wandering soul," they said, "a lost one may need it." The hearth was sacred, so was the bowl, so was the act of eating. In winter, even a turnip became a holy thing. Once in a while, just before bed, there came a knock, a traveler, a beggar, a soul with nothing but frost on their boots, and you had almost nothing, but you gave them a crust, a spoonful of soup, the warmest spot near the fire. Because tomorrow it might be you at someone else's door, and you'd want the same. In giving food, you gave mercy, and mercy helped you sleep. Not everyone ate equally. The man who worked the hardest often ate the least. The eldest child gave their portion to the youngest. The mother, she went without more often than not. You didn't complain, you didn't argue, that was the order of things. But sometimes, you noticed your lord's dogs eating better than you, and you swallowed your thoughts, along with your soup. Because silence filled more bellies than words ever could. With bowls scraped clean and spoons wiped against rough wool sleeves, the family settled. Children leaned on each other. Parents tucked in cloaks. The fire popped quietly, and before the last ember dimmed, someone always said, "Tomorrow we'll boil bones. Tomorrow maybe butter. Tomorrow the bread will rise." It wasn't a promise, but it was a kind of prayer. A full belly was rare, but hope was always served warm, even after eating. You weren't full. Your stomach murmured. Your fingers were cold. Your jaw ached from chewing hard bread. But you slept anyway, because what else could you do? You held your hunger like a blanket, tucked it close, warmed your dreams with it, and drifted off into the dark. A peasant's dinner was not a meal. It was a quiet ritual, a final act before facing the night, a candle in the dark. There were no courses, no recipes, only memories and necessity. But in every spoonful there was history, in every crust resilience, in every swallow the will to survive. So tonight, as your eyes grow heavy and your body still, imagine that simple bowl of stew, steam rising, bread crumbling, silence settling, and know you have enough, at least for now. In your world, a bed is soft, it's private. It welcomes you at the end of the day with warmth, fabric, and foam. In the medieval world, a bed was whatever you had. Sometimes that meant a pile of straw, sometimes just your cloak on the floor, sometimes a real bed made of wood and ropes. But for most peasants, it meant a corner of the room, shared with others, and cold. If you were lucky, you had a straw tick, a mattress of sorts. Imagine a cloth sack sewn from linen or hemp. Inside, straw, dried rushes, maybe old hay. You laid it on a wooden frame or directly on the floor. Sometimes there was no sack at all, just loose straw piled high, every stalk broken and rough. You fluffed it once a week, maybe changed the straw once a season. It crackled when you moved. It poked your skin. It attracted mice, but it was better than dirt. And in winter, it lifted you just far enough from the frozen earth to sleep. Beds, if they existed, were simple. A wooden frame, 4 legs, and a grid of ropes woven like a hammock. On top you placed the straw tick, but over time the ropes sagged. They creaked. They loosened. So every night before sleeping someone would say, "Time to tighten the bed." Yes, that's where the phrase comes from. You used a wooden peg, twisting it slowly. The ropes groaned, the frame stiffened, and only then could you sleep, hopefully. No one slept alone, not because they didn't want to, but because they couldn't afford to. Warmth was shared. Space was shared, bedding was shared. A bed might hold 2 parents, 3 children, a grandparent, and maybe the dog side by side, head to toe, breath mingling, bodies overlapping. Privacy was a luxury, so was stretching your legs. You learned to sleep without rolling over, without snoring, without dreams that made you flinch. Sleep was still, tight, and communal. So what did they sleep under? Not sheets, not duvets, not cotton quilts sewn by grandmothers. They slept under old cloaks, worn tunics, animal skins, straw sacks, and each other. Sometimes a heavy woolen blanket, if the family had one, but it was often thin, threadbare, frayed at the edges, smelling of smoke and years. They wrapped themselves like bundles, layers upon layers of clothing and rags. The goal wasn't comfort, it was insulation. Beds were not clean, not by modern standards, not by any standard. The straw was old, the wool was unwashed, the wooden frame never saw soap, and in the dark, the bugs came. Fleas, lice, bed bugs, mites. They lived in the mattress, they nested in the seams, they crawled along your skin as you slept. Scratching was constant, scabs never healed. And sleep was often interrupted by a sudden sharp bite. You slapped your arm, rolled over, whispered a prayer, and tried again. In some homes the bed was elevated, not for comfort but for warmth, because below you on the lower levels slept the animals, cows, sheep, goats, chickens. Their breath rose, their bodies gave off heat. Their presence kept the frost away. The family slept on a wooden loft directly above the stable. Sometimes you heard chewing, sometimes snorting, sometimes worse. But no one complained, because the cow might just be the reason you woke up alive. Not everyone had a frame. Some peasants slept directly on the earthen floor, no straw, no sack, no barrier, just a rough, cold surface, sometimes padded with moss, sometimes nothing at all. Others carved small alcoves into the stone walls, crawled in sideways, covered themselves with cloaks, and prayed for morning. There are even stories of people sleeping sitting upright, because lying down made them cough from the cold air in their chest. Sleep wasn't gentle. Sleep was an act of endurance. Sometimes the bed was just the fire pit. After the fire burned low and the family huddled close, they didn't move. They stayed where they were, on stools against the wall, on the dirt beside the ash. Children fell asleep in their mother's arms. Fathers leaned forward, still in boots. A dog curled under the bench. There was no bedtime, only collapse. And in the morning, ash on your cloak, a stiff neck, and the slow ache of survival. A medieval bed wasn't soft, or sweet, or scented with lavender. It didn't cradle you, it held you, roughly, closely, with scratchy straw and sour wool and the breath of someone beside you. And yet, it worked, because somehow, despite everything, the peasants slept, not peacefully but deeply, because the day had drained them. The cold had shaped them, and the bed, whatever form it took, was the last refuge. In modern times, beds are replaced easily. In medieval times, a bed was an heirloom. A wooden frame, if you had one, was passed down from parent to child, repaired, reinforced, carved with initials. A straw mattress could be emptied and refilled, but the cloth sack was valuable. Sometimes the most valuable thing the family owned, after the cooking pot. So when someone died, their bed became part of their will, not their land, not their name, their blanket, their sleeping rope, their nail-driven wooden cot. To sleep in the same bed as your father once did meant warmth, but also memory. Memory of cold, of survival, of love wrapped in wool and splinters. Beds weren't always safe. There were no bed frames with rounded corners, no flame-retardant bedding, no safety rails, just raw wood, old straw, and firelight. Sometimes a spark jumped from the hearth, landed in dry straw, and by the time the family stirred, it was too late. Flames climbed blankets, ropes snapped, smoke choked. Other times the bed collapsed beneath its weight. The ropes were old, the knots undone. A loud crack, a crash, and bruises for everyone. People died in their beds not from age, but from accidents. There were stories, every village had them, of beds that took people. An old man who lay down healthy and was gone by dawn. A girl who coughed through the night until her body stilled. A baby swaddled too tightly in wool, suffocating silently in the dark. The bed became a symbol of both rest and risk. You laid down not knowing if you'd rise again. And so people whispered to the wood before sleep, "Hold me until morning, keep me breathing, let me see the sun." Because beds were not just where life paused, they were often where it ended. Today we sleep 8 hours straight. In medieval times, that was rare. People spoke of 2 sleeps: first sleep, from nightfall until midnight; second sleep, from about 2 a.m. until dawn. Between them, a strange, quiet time. People would stir the fire, tend to animals, pray, talk softly, even visit neighbors. This middle of the night was normal, expected, part of life. Sleep came in waves, not blocks, because the dark was long and the cold didn't wait. Lying flat was not always best. Some slept, curled tightly in a fetal position, sitting against a wall, propped up on elbows, with legs drawn up to conserve heat, back to back with a sibling or spouse. The elderly sometimes slept seated upright, cloaks wrapped around them like tents. This helped their lungs, prevented coughing fits, made it easier to wake if something stirred. Children were tucked under arms, infants wrapped in layers, faces barely visible. There was no comfort, only instinct and shared body heat. Now let us leave the hut and peer into the manor. The bed of a noble was an altar, 4 posts, carved wood, velvet or silk curtains, feather mattress, goose-down pillows, sheets laundered with lavender. Sometimes the bed stood on a dais, a stage. Servants undressed their lord beside it. Warm bricks were wrapped in cloth and placed beneath the sheets. This wasn't just for sleep, it was for status, for making heirs, for being seen. But even in these soft places, people died the same, and in time. Even these beds turned cold. The poorest peasants, they slept outside, in stables, in lean-tos, under wagons, beside dying fires. Their bed was the grass, The mud, a tree trunk, their own arms wrapped tight across their chest. They lay with one eye open, shoes still on, belt still tied, because the night took things, and sleep made you vulnerable. In the end, a bed is just a space to rest, to sigh, to let your weight fall. And in medieval times that space was hard-won, hard-floored, hard-used, but it still offered something priceless: pause, between toil and more toil, between the dark and the darker, between hunger and hope, a place to close your eyes and think, I've made it through another day. And for the peasant, that was enough. So the next time you lie in your own bed, remember the straw, the fleas, the fire crackling too close, the child pressed to your side, the cold that waited just outside the blanket's edge. Remember that even the humblest bed was a battleground, but also a sanctuary. And tonight, as you close your eyes, may you find the same peace they once did. In the cold heart of a medieval winter, survival was not about courage, it was about warmth. And sometimes, warmth had 4 legs: cows, goats, sheep, dogs, even chickens. They weren't just livestock, they were heaters, fellow breathers, bedmates. Because when frost crept through the wooden walls and the wind howled through the thatch roof, you needed a body beside you. Anybody. Peasant homes were often just one room. There was no upstairs, no hallway, no nursery, no barn. Everyone lived together. People, pigs, chickens, cats, dogs, goats. The animals had their space, sometimes a corner, sometimes the same straw bed, sometimes under the bench, sometimes right in the middle of the floor. Children climbed over them. Mothers stepped around them. Fathers grumbled but never pushed them out, because in that room, every degree of warmth mattered. A full-grown cow can weigh over 1,000 pounds. But more importantly, it gives off 1,000 watts of body heat, more than a campfire, more than a lantern. That heat rose slowly into the air, warmed the rafters, melted the freight, kept babies from turning blue. Families often kept 1 or 2 cows inside during the coldest months. Tethered, quiet, chewing endlessly. Sometimes they gave milk, sometimes they just gave comfort. You'd fall asleep to the sound of hooves shifting in straw, and the slow, steady breath of something too big to lose. Goats were smaller, restless, sharp-hooved, always chewing something. But they were warm, and in winter warmth made up for smell. Some families let goats sleep beside the infant's cradle, to act like a second mother, to lend heat, to keep the child calm. The goat would grunt, shuffle, maybe snort, and the baby would sleep soundly, because something alive was near. And in the dark that meant safety. Peasant dogs were not pets, not in the way we think of them now. They weren't coddled, they weren't named like children. They didn't wear collars, but they had a place in the bed, usually near the feet, sometimes curled under the arms of a child, sometimes near the door, half guard, half blanket. They were lean, flea-ridden, scarred but loyal and quiet and warm. A good dog could be the difference between a shivering night and a night where you actually slept. There were cats, too, not in the bed, but in the room. perched high on beams, stalking mice, yawning through the night. They didn't offer heat, but they kept the food safe, and sometimes they crept down into the straw, curled behind your knees, purred against your spine, a whisper of warmth with claws and attitude, and for a moment, the bed didn't feel so empty. Chickens were precious. They gave eggs, sometimes meat, sometimes feathers, but in winter they needed shelter too. So they lived in baskets near the fire, or roosted on a crossbeam above the bed, or nested in corners with dry straw and soft clucks. Their warmth was small, but their rhythm was steady. The night passed to the sound of their shifting weight, the rustle of feathers, the soft, muffled coo of something content. And in that soft sound you knew morning would come, eventually. Of course, there was a cost. Animals smelled, of dung, of sweat, of fur and feed and filth. The house reeked of it. And when you lay in the straw, eyes half closed, blanket pulled tight, you couldn't escape it. You breathed in wool and ash and wet hay and the sweet sour scent of manure and wet hide. It clung to your nose, your clothes, your dreams. But it was part of the deal. Warmth. At a price. For the youngest children it wasn't strange. They didn't know a world without animals indoors, without hooves clicking on the floor, without feathers fluttering above their heads. To them, the goat was a pillow, the cow was a wall, the dog was a friend. They learned early. Warmth was not about softness, it was about sharing space, about bodies, about the breath of another creature, alive and close. Even if it drooled, to sleep with animals was not luxury, not novelty, it was necessity. They gave no permission, they simply existed beside you. And that was enough, because in a world of frostbitten nights, they were part of the survival strategy, not because they were cute, but because they were alive. And in the dark, survival always huddles together. It didn't happen often, but when it did, the room went quiet. A cow that groaned once too deeply, a chicken that didn't cluck by morning, a dog that didn't rise when the fire was stirred. You noticed first by the cold, the absence of breath, the stillness of the straw, the heavy air of something missing. And then the smell. Not decay, not yet, but a sweetness that didn't belong. The family wouldn't cry, but they would whisper. She was old. He was tired. The winter was long. No one said what they all feared, that without that warmth someone else might not survive the next night. There were stories, old ones, told by candlelight, passed from mouth to ear across generations. They said, if the goat speaks to you in a dream, listen. If the cat won't come near, beware the illness. If the cow lies too still, death is close. In a world with little science and less certainty, animals were omens. Not just bodies, but spirits, messengers, silent protectors. When you dreamed of fur or feather, you paid attention, because sometimes. The dog barked in the dark and no one was at the door. The rooster crowed before dawn and someone died before noon. The mare refused to enter the hut and the storm came that evening. People remembered these things. Some believed animals absorbed bad spirits, that they took the illness into themselves, took the fever from the baby, took the curse from the ground. You'd wake in the middle of the night, gasping, sweating, sick, and see your dog staring at you, silent still. The next morning, your fever was gone, and the dog wouldn't eat, They'd call it a trade, one soul shielding another. People didn't explain it, they just remembered. Not all warmth was bodily, some was born of kindness. A crust of bread broken in half, a bowl of broth slid across the floor to the old hound, a bit of barley tossed into the goat's pail. When food was scarce, sharing with animals was a choice. A hard one. They help us survive. They need it more. They would share with us. No one said what lingered in their mind. They are not just animals. They are part of us. Every family had one. The cow that leaned its head when you whispered. The goat that followed you more than the rest. The cat that never scratched you. The chicken that let you hold it longer than it should have. You didn't name them usually, not out loud, but in your head, they had one. You told them secrets, sighed into their fur, cried beside them when no one else could see, and when you slept. You made sure they were close because you didn't just want their warmth. You wanted their presence. There were nights colder than others, nights where the fire gave up, where the blankets felt like paper, where even the animals shivered. Those nights, families did something simple. They touched, not just each other, but their animals. A hand on a dog's side, a foot pressed against a goat, a child curled under the cow's flank. No one spoke, but everyone felt it, that shared understanding between species. If we stay close, we'll make it. Spring came. Snow melted. The animals returned to their places outside, but the house felt emptier, quieter, colder even in the warmth. No low breathing in the dark, no hooves against the wood, no feathers brushing your hair. And though you swept the straw, washed the floor, aired the blankets, you missed them. Because something in your body had gotten used to sleeping not alone, not even just with family, but with something older, something simpler, something alive. Years passed. Children grew. They moved into houses with real barns, lofts, separate rooms, even beds of their own. But they never forgot. They told their children, once I slept beside a goat. Once my blanket was a dog's fur. Once a chicken warmed my feet. The children laughed. But the memory stayed. And when the wind howled on some distant night, they wished for a heartbeat beside them. A soft snort, a shared breath, something from long ago that still felt close. To sleep beside animals was not strange, it was not shameful, it was not backward, it was wise, because in the dark, in the cold, in the silence of winter nights, survival was not about being strong, it was about being near, near to warmth, near to life, near to something that watched over you while you slept. And in that breath, in that closeness, there was peace after all the work. After the sun dipped behind the trees, after the last pot was scrubbed and the last goat tethered and the last prayer whispered near the fire, the sounds changed. The clatter of feet became silence. The hammering of tools gave way to crackling logs. Voices fell to murmurs, then to breaths. And then you heard the world again, the true world. The one that only speaks at night. The fire didn't sleep. It hissed. It popped. It sighed through the logs. Even when the flames died low, you heard the coals, like whispers between old friends. A soft crack, a shifting ember, a sudden snap that made someone flinch in their blankets. It was the heartbeat of the house. And in the dead of winter it sounded like life itself. Everything creaked. The beams, the bed, the shutters, old timber groaned with each gust of wind. The roof whispered as it settled. Sometimes it felt like the house was breathing, stretching in the cold, settling under the weight of frost. You'd lie still, listening, wondering if it was the wood or something else, something walking overhead. And then there was the howl, not close, not often, but always from far enough to feel unreal, a wolf, or something like one. It sang its hunger to the trees, a sound stretched thin across miles. High, piercing, almost human. Children pulled blankets tighter. Adults said nothing. Because the howl didn't need explaining. You just knew. Roofs were made of straw and sticks, tightly packed, but not perfect. The wind found ways in. It slid between thatch, whistled through cracks, made the rafters moan. At night, wind sounded different. It didn't just blow, it spoke. Some said it was the dead, others said it was saints. But everyone listened, because when the wind changed direction, it meant something was coming. A bark, sudden, sharp, 2 or 3 yelps, then silence. From the corner where the dog slept or from outside near the trees. It made your heart beat faster, even if you said it's nothing. Because sometimes it was a fox, or a thief, or a shadow that didn't belong, and the dog always knew first. You'd hear it once, then again, hoo, low, echoing. It came from the trees, or the old church ruin, or the dead branch by the well. Owls weren't feared, but they were respected. Some said they saw death. Others said they guided souls. You didn't talk to owls. You listened. And when they stopped calling, that's when people worried. It was so soft you thought you imagined it. A rustle, a scratch, a tiny deliberate sound, beneath the bed, inside the wall, under your pillow. Mice lived close. They chewed cloth, nibbled crumbs, built homes beside your own. You didn't kill them, not always, because they were part of the rhythm. Even their sounds were familiar. And then, nothing. A moment between wind and wolf, between creaks and rustles. A silence so full it felt like a presence. It wrapped the house in stillness, pressed against your ears. Some called it peace, others feared it, because in that silence you heard yourself, your own breath, your thoughts, your heartbeat. It was the oldest sound of all, and sometimes the hardest to bear. The medieval night was not quiet, it was alive, not with noise, but with presence. Each creak, each call, each shifting breath in the dark was a reminder. You were not alone. The world went on, the wind moved, the owl hunted, the fire hummed, and through it all you lay still, listening, learning, waiting for morning. Not every night was dry. Sometimes the clouds broke open, and rain fell in slow, steady sheets, not just drops, but whole rivers from the sky. You heard it first on the thatch. Puh, 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 puh. Then faster, then louder. The roof absorbed most of it, but not all. Little leaks formed. You placed a bowl beneath them, or a wooden bucket, or just ignored it. Because when the rain came, you were grateful. It meant water for the morning. It meant the wolves would stay away. It meant sound to cover other things. when the skies cracked open and thunder rolled across the hills. People didn't just shiver, they listened, because thunder wasn't just weather, it was a sign. Some said it was God's anger. Others said the dead were riding. Children believed giants were walking above the clouds. The earth trembled. The animals stirred. The fire sputtered. And when lightning flashed, casting the entire hut into momentary white light, you saw every face still, eyes wide, waiting for the next rumble. Snow doesn't fall silently, not if you listen close. It taps on the roof like the softest fingers. It lands in waves, it makes the night even quieter by smothering sound. The outside world vanishes, no crunch of boots, no calls from the forest, just the dull hush of a white, slow burial, and in that muffled silence, you hear everything inside more clearly. The breath of the goat, the creak of the rafter, the shift of someone trying to turn in their sleep. Snow brings stillness, and stillness speaks volumes. Sometimes you heard them. Footsteps, not yours, not the dog's, someone or something moving outside the hut, slow, deliberate, squishing through wet earth. You froze, everyone did. No one spoke because the steps didn't belong. You counted them. 1, 2, 3, then they stopped. You didn't check, you didn't open the door, you waited and hoped they weren't waiting too. If your home had a barn, even just a lean-to for the oxen, you'd hear it groan at night. A board shifted, a latch tapped, a moan like wind but not quite. You told yourself, it's just the wind, just the cow, just wood. But sometimes it sounded like breathing, the kind that didn't belong to animals or humans, just something old. Sometimes you'd wake up because you heard something in your sleep. A scream, a whisper, a lullaby. You opened your eyes, but the room was still, the fire low, the dog asleep, no one speaking. And yet the sound lingered in your ear. You asked your sister, "Did you hear that?" She shook her head. But she didn't go back to sleep. Villages had bells, big ones for the church, small ones for the animals, but at night, they stayed quiet. Unless there was trouble, a fire, a death, a raid. And if a bell rang after midnight, you rose, no matter how tired, no matter how cold, because bells didn't lie. And their echo didn't stop at the edge of the village, it followed you into your dreams. This was the most human sound of all. A baby's cry, sharp, high, urgent. Sometimes it was yours, sometimes the neighbor's. But in one-room huts, a baby crying meant everyone woke up. The dog stirred, the goat grunted, the rooster flapped its wings, and the mother, she sighed, lifted her child, rocked slowly, no words, just the creak of the bench, the hush of cloth, and the sob of new life, not yet used to the dark. Not all silence was peaceful. Sometimes it came too suddenly. The dog stopped barking, the wind stopped howling, even the fire stopped crackling. And in that pause, you felt fear, because silence like that meant change, a presence, a storm, a birth, a death. You listened harder, but the silence only deepened. Like a mouth that wouldn't speak, like a shadow that refused to move. And you waited, tense, until sound returned. even if it was just a rat. The medieval night was not dark, it was loud, in its own quiet way. Not with shouting, not with music, but with whispers from the earth. You learned the language Mtumu. Fire meant safety. Rain meant grace. Footsteps meant danger. Creaks meant change. And silence always meant you weren't alone. And so you slept, not with your ears shut, but wide open, because the night was not your enemy. It was your companion, speaking softly, breathing slowly, watching with eyes you couldn't see. Today, darkness is a switch, a dimmer, a preference. In the medieval world, darkness was a presence. It filled the room, the corners, the space under the bed, the thatch above your head. It pressed against your chest, made the fire seem smaller, turned silence into something thick and crawling. It wasn't just the absence of light, it was the arrival of something else. Something ancient, something waiting, something felt, not seen. Every night was a gamble. There were no doctors, no diagnoses, no guarantees. You went to sleep hoping. The fever wouldn't rise, the cough wouldn't deepen. The pain in your gut wasn't the plague, because people died in their sleep, not just the old, not just the sick, but the young, the strong, the blessed. You'd wake to a cold hand beside you, or a sibling who wouldn't stir, or a cry that never came again. And every time you closed your eyes after that, you wondered if you'd open them again. The dog knew. Before the human ear caught it, before the human heart could name it, the dog would lift its head, a low growl, a stare at the door, a tense stillness, and you would sit up, blanket to your chin, fire casting flickers on the wall, listening, waiting, praying it was a fox, but knowing sometimes it wasn't. It didn't always happen, but sometimes. There was a knock, not a bang, not pounding, just one soft, deliberate strike on wood, at the door or the shutter or the wall. You sat still. Did I hear it? No one moved. No one spoke. Because if you answered, you were inviting something in. Not a man, not a thief, but something older. Something that knew your name, and once in it never left, so you stayed silent and waited for the sun. In firelight, shadows danced. They flickered, shifted, curled along the beams, but sometimes one shadow didn't move. It stayed. At the same angle, the same shape, even when the fire shifted, even when you blinked, you told yourself, it's just the bench. It's the sack of grain. It's nothing. But you turned away, and you didn't look again, because in the medieval night you never stared too long at what didn't move. It wasn't human, but it wasn't entirely animal either. A sound from the trees. Long, drawn-out, half-sob, half-scream, it came and went, no rhythm, no warning. Some said it was the night hag. Others said lost souls. Some said the forest itself, remembering things. You covered your ears, you prayed, you pressed your body against the dog, but still. You listened, because some cries called your name. And not everyone could resist answering. Not all fear came from the outside. Sometimes it was delivered in sleep. You dreamed of a door that wouldn't close, a candle that wouldn't light, a child crying in a room you didn't recognize, a cold breath against your neck. And when you woke, the room felt different. The fire was lower, the air tighter. You told no one, because everyone had those dreams, and no one wanted to know what they meant. Before medicine had books, there was only fear. If your child burned with fever, if their skin turned black, if they coughed blood, you didn't call a doctor. You called a priest or no one at all, and in the night you listened to the breathing. Slower, shallower, gone. And then silence, and then mourning, and then the fear that whatever had taken them might still be in the room, might be in you now. Some fears weren't mystical. They were personal. What if you stole too much grain, lied to your neighbor, yelled at your child? What if your goat died because you didn't tether her right? What if the prayer you skipped mattered? At night, those questions came back. They didn't scream, they whispered, they tickled your conscience, they pricked your dreams. You turned on your side, covered your ears, but the fear followed. Because guilt doesn't need light, it only needs time. In the medieval night, people didn't fear monsters, they feared what they already knew. Sickness, hunger, shadows, sounds, silence, themselves they wrapped themselves in cloth, in prayer, in hope, and still, some nights they didn't sleep. Not because the world was too loud, but because their fears whispered just loud enough. When fear crept close into the rafters, into the chest, into the bones, people turned to small protections. A twig of rowan tied with red thread, a carved charm worn around the neck, a worn piece of parchment tucked under a blanket with scripture written in a trembling hand. Water blessed by the priest, salt at the windowsill, an iron nail driven into the threshold, each one a silent prayer, a keep evil out, let us sleep in peace, don't let it in tonight. Because faith didn't stop fear, but it gave it boundaries. It was rare, but it happened. A knock after dark, a voice hoarse and unfamiliar. Please, a place by the fire. My child is sick. I have walked for miles. You opened the door slowly, if at all. Sometimes it was a monk with tattered robes and eyes like stone. Sometimes a soldier with boots caked in blood and stories best left untold. Sometimes a beggar with nothing to lose but the cold, and sometimes they said nothing at all, just stood there waiting. The fire behind you hissed, and you had to decide, do I bring the fear inside or leave it at the door? Some nights you heard footsteps you knew, a familiar limp, a dragging gait, a knock in the rhythm your grandfather used, but he'd been dead 5 winters. Still you listened, still you waited. People spoke of the restless dead, those with unpaid debts, unspoken grief, unfinished promises. They came not to haunt, but to remind. That memory lingers, that blood remembers. You didn't speak to them, you didn't look at them, you acknowledged them. With silence, with stillness, with a whisper in your mind. You are seen, now go. Some walls were thin, made of mud or timber or nothing but straw, and through them voices traveled. You heard your neighbors arguing, a baby crying 2 doors down, someone praying loudly, desperately, and sometimes you heard things no one else did, voices that didn't belong to the living or the known. They didn't speak in words, just pressure and rhythm, a chant you couldn't decipher. But somehow understood. Some priests slept like rocks, others never truly rested. They wandered through villages with oil lamps and muttered blessings. touching doorposts and tracing crosses into foggy air. Some said they were protecting us. Some said they feared what they might find if they stayed still. Either way, when you heard the creak of their steps in the road at night, you didn't open the window. You let them pass, because if they stopped and knocked, it meant your house was not as safe as you thought. Not every fear had a name. Some were shapes behind the curtain. Some were dreams that followed you into daylight. Some were thoughts that slithered under your ribs and stayed there. They didn't tell the children. They didn't even tell each other. Because to speak it aloud was to give it form. And so they kept quiet and feared alone, but not completely alone, because everyone, in every hut, every village, every night, was doing the same thing. Fearing, silently, together. There was no ceremony to it, no bedtime routine like we have now. Just lay out the straw, stir the coals, check the latch, whisper a prayer. Sometimes it was to God, sometimes to a parent who had passed, sometimes to no one at all. And then you lay down and listened and waited and hoped, because sleep was not guaranteed. It was a gift, and every night it came. You were grateful. Eventually, exhaustion triumphed over fear.
No movement at all.
Curling toward the rafters, disappearing like memory. Sometimes your breath froze against the wool of your collar, against your sibling's cheek, against the window you had no reason to open. It was proof that you were alive, that your lungs still worked, that something warm still existed in this frozen world. And when someone stopped breathing, you saw it first, not with sound, but with absence. A space where breath used to be. Animals helped keep you warm. Chickens beneath the bed, a dog curled at your feet, a goat resting against your back. But not all made it. Some mornings a hen wouldn't stir. The goat's breath would be still. The piglet's body would be stiff, curled like a dropped sack. There were no words for it, just quiet. A shiver, a glance, a hole dug when the ground thawed, and a deeper silence that stayed, because if they, the strong, the thick-skinned, couldn't survive the cold, what chance did you have? Sometimes it was hunger. Sometimes it was a cough. Sometimes it was just the cold. A child too small to understand, too young to warm themselves. They cried and cried and cried. You held them, rocked them, sang the same line over and over. But the night didn't end, and the cold didn't care. When dawn came, they were quieter, sometimes asleep, sometimes not. And that silence, it rang louder than any wail. It was never just yours, even if it smelled like you, even if your name was stitched in the corner. Someone colder always needed it more. You gave it up without question, to a sister shivering, to a grandfather wheezing, to a child with blue lips, and in that giving, you stayed cold, but somehow you didn't freeze. Because warmth shared was warmth returned, and kindness, on the coldest nights, was the only fire you had left. It always felt like betrayal. You lit it, fed it, watched it dance with hope, and sometime before dawn, when your body slept hardest, it left. A pile of gray, a faint line of smoke, No more warmth. You didn't scream, didn't curse, you just pulled your knees in tighter, pressed your hands into your armpits, counted the minutes until the rooster crowed, and when morning came, you didn't say anything. You just started again. There's a silence that lingers longer than snow, heavier than stone, colder than ice. It's the silence of a body that won't move, of a breath that won't come. You shake them, you whisper, you press your forehead to theirs, but it's done. The cold has claimed them, softly, quietly, completely. And the blanket they once used is now shared by someone else. Not out of disrespect, but because warmth is still needed, and grief cannot stop the wind. The cold broke people. Not loudly, not violently, it wore them down, one toe, one breath, one forgotten memory at a time. You forgot the sound of birds, the feel of grass, the taste of apples. You forgot what it felt like to not be cold, and when you were too tired to cry, too numb to pray, you imagined warmth, not a fire, not the sun, but your mother's lap, the weight of a hand on your head, the lullaby you hadn't heard since you were 5. The mind's final shield, thin, fragile, sacred, it always came back, eventually. A breeze that wasn't cruel, a shaft of sunlight that reached the floor, a child laughing just because they could. You didn't run into the fields, didn't sing with joy, you just stood in the doorway, felt the air on your face, and knew we made it. You buried the ones who didn't. You lit a stronger fire, you washed your clothes, and you began again. Because the cold had passed, but not without leaving something behind. Cold taught them to endure, to share, to hold, to let go. It didn't ask permission, didn't wait for readiness, it simply came. And the peasants, the forgotten, the nameless, the tired, met it with wool and breath and heart. They didn't fight the cold, they outlasted it, and in that they left behind a warmth that echoes even now. In your blood, in your breath, in your quiet, tonight remember them and sleep warmer for it. There were no bedrooms, no corridors, no privacy. The medieval home was one space, one hearth, one roof, one bed if you were lucky, or just floor and straw. And so you didn't sleep next to others, you slept with them. Arms brushing, breath mingling, dreams colliding. Not because you chose to, because there was nowhere else to go. And even if there had been, you wouldn't want to sleep alone. The word bed meant something different. It could be a wooden platform with ropes stretched across, a pile of straw with cloth draped over it, a sheepskin rug near the fire, a space carved in the hayloft above the animals. It wasn't soft, it wasn't clean, it wasn't private, but it was shared. The mother curled around the infant. The older brother pressed into the wall. The dog claimed the warmest spot without asking. No one complained. No one asked for space because warmth was more important than comfort. You couldn't survive the winter night alone. Even the fire couldn't do it all. It faded. It flickered. It forgot you by midnight. But bodies remembered. So you pressed your back against your sister, held your child close to your belly, tangled your legs with someone else's even if you didn't remember who in the morning. You didn't speak, you didn't move. You just shared heat, one heart warming another, one breath saving 2 lives. It was never peaceful like the paintings. It was full of sounds. The wheeze of the old man, The whimper of the toddler, the dog's nails scratching, the goat shifting below the floorboards, and voices, soft, tired, honest. Did you hear that? Your foot's cold. Tell me again the story of the river. Will the priest come tomorrow? Are you still awake? These weren't interruptions, they were lifelines. Because sleep in the dark, in the cold, was easier when you weren't the only one awake. If you were small, you fit anywhere. Under the blanket, on top of a sack of grain, wedged between your brother's knees. You didn't mind. You didn't know better. Sometimes you shared a pillow made from a folded tunic, sometimes just your mother's shoulder. You fell asleep to the rhythm of breathing and the whisper of prayers, and if you cried, a hand reached for you. Any hand, because you weren't a child of just your parents. You belonged to everyone in that room. There was something sacred in hearing the same cough night after night, the same sigh, the same rustle, the same voice muttering half-dreams to itself. It meant they were still alive. It meant you weren't alone. You memorized the sounds of your family sleeping, so if one night a sound was missing, you noticed, and even in your sleep, your heart braced itself, because silence had meaning, and absence was loud. Not every shared bed was peaceful. You argued, you elbowed, you pulled too much blanket, you hogged the heat. Sometimes you turned away from each other. Let the cold settle between your spines. But when the fire faded, when the night grew long, when a strange noise snapped you from your dream, you reached back, even if just a toe, even if just a breath shared again. Because anger could wait until morning, cold could not. When someone came, a cousin from another village, a stranger seeking shelter, a wounded soldier, you made room, you always made room. Someone gave up the bed, someone doubled up, someone moved to the floor. It didn't matter if you were tired, didn't matter if you snored, because to send someone into the dark, into the cold, was unthinkable. You slept closer, tighter, together, because warmth shared was life extended. Every night followed a pattern. You checked the fire, you latched the door, you whispered a prayer, you tucked the children in. And then someone told a story, maybe short, maybe familiar, maybe passed down from a time before memory. It didn't matter. What mattered was that it filled the room with something other than fear. And when the story ended, you didn't say good night. You just let the quiet come. Together. They didn't sleep in groups because they wanted to. They slept in groups because the night demanded it. Because the cold did not care for loneliness, and fear grew in empty corners. So they pressed close. They shared breath. They tangled limbs. They let go of comfort to hold on to life. And in that closeness, in that chaos, they found peace. Not in silence, but in company. It didn't happen often, but when it did, no one forgot. A sound in the night, a shout, a gasp, a word spoken with such urgency it woke everyone at once. And in the silence that followed, no one knew who had cried out. No one remembered what was said, but they all felt it. The same dread, the same image in the back of the mind. A door swinging open, a cold wind rushing in, a shadow standing where no shadow should be. Some said it was just the wind. Others believed it was something else, something they had faced, together, in sleep. There was a trick older than memory, when the cold was deepest, the fear sharpest, and the fire near gone. They formed a circle, backs to the inside, faces outward like a fortress, the oldest in the center, the youngest beneath the arms of many, a baby held between chests wrapped in scarves and hope. They said nothing, just settled, just breathed, just became a ring of warmth against the dark. The wind howled, but the ring held, and in the morning, when the rooster crowed, they uncoiled like petals in light, alive. Sometimes someone was missing, a space in the straw, a dip in the blanket, a scent that had not faded yet. They didn't talk about it. Not right away, because the space still held shape, still held memory, and in the middle of the night someone might still reach toward it, expecting a hand, a snore, a mutter, instead cold. The cold of absence, the cold of death. But over time the straw flattened, the warmth faded, and someone new filled the space, not to replace but to remember. It wasn't a punishment, not always. Some chose it, the quiet one, the outcast, the widow, the man with dreams too loud to share. They slept apart, in corners, in lofts, in sheds, and they said they liked it. Said the breathing of others annoyed them. Said they preferred their own thoughts. But when the nights grew long, when wolves howled closer, when something tapped the shutters, you could almost hear their regret, the longing behind their cough, the pause before they answered, "I'm fine." They weren't, but they'd chosen the cold, and the cold does not comfort. No one knew it would be the last, not that night. She lay as she always did between her daughters. A hand curled around the hem of someone's shirt. She murmured a prayer, or maybe it was a recipe, or maybe nothing at all, and then she slept. In the morning she was still. So still that even the dog knew. They didn't scream, didn't cry. They lay with her a little longer, as if holding her could bring the warmth back. It didn't. But they tried. Because love does not retreat with the cold, there were confessions only whispered after midnight. A fear, a secret, a sin. Someone spoke, quiet and shaky. The others listened, didn't interrupt, didn't judge. Because the dark made honesty easier. You didn't have to look someone in the eye, didn't have to hold shame alone. The words floated, and settled, and stayed, and when sleep came again it came lighter. Because sometimes what you carried was heavier than the cold, and speaking it was the warmth you needed. No one talked about it, not really. But there was always one moment when someone stirred in fear or sorrow or silence, and a hand found theirs, or touched their back, or rested just for a second on their shoulder. It didn't need a name, it wasn't about comfort or fixing anything. It was a message. I'm here. I heard you. We are still together. And sometimes that touch did more than any fire could. It was a superstition. They said if you turned to face the wall you wouldn't wake up, that the night would take you, that you'd forget to breathe, that your dreams would open into somewhere else, and not let you back. So even when space was tight, even when you hated the smell of your brother's feet, you faced the room, faced the fire, faced the life behind you. Because no one wanted to sleep like the dead, not yet. They woke one by one with yawns, with stretches, with complaints about elbows and knees. The fire was out, the light was gray, the air still cold, but they smiled. Because they were still here. Blankets were folded, straw shaken, bodies limped into movement, and the bed, that messy, noisy, crowded place, was a place of survival. It had held them, all of them, through another night, and tomorrow it would do it again. They didn't sleep in groups because they were weak. They slept in groups because they were wise, because they understood that warmth is not just heat. It's presence. It's breath. It's the rhythm of a body beside yours. They knew fear. They knew cold. They knew loss. But they also knew togetherness. And in that closeness, in that nightly ritual of shared silence and shared life, they endured. And tonight, as you drift off alone, remember, they are with you, in the stories, in the breath, in the dark, and you are not alone either. The fire didn't tend itself. The animals stirred, the wind changed, the dark moved. So someone had to watch. Every village had at least one. Sometimes an elder, sometimes a father, sometimes a boy too restless to sleep. They stayed up, not all night, just enough. Enough to listen, enough to guard, enough to make sure dawn still came. They weren't heroes, they were tired, but they watched anyway, because someone had to. They sat near the hearth, legs tucked under, eyes half closed. They stirred the embers, added a stick, watched sparks dance like silent thoughts. Everyone else slept, their breath soft, their limbs slack, but the watcher stayed, not because they wanted to, because they were afraid of what would happen if they didn't. What if something comes in? What if the wind takes the roof? What if they stop breathing? And the watcher's job was to ask the questions no one else dared. Once the house was quiet, the watcher heard everything. The shifting of straw, a pot settling as it cooled, the low mumble of a dreamer, the crack of a log deep in the fire outside, an owl, a distant bark, the flap of something too large to be a bird. Not all sounds were real, but they felt real. And so the watcher stayed alert, listening not for what was, but for what might be. Because possibility was the loudest thing of all. It wasn't superstition. Doors were weak, locks were nothing but rope and hope, and what lay beyond the door was everything unknown. A neighbor, a wolf, a robber, something older, so the watcher faced it, always. Sometimes they'd place a chair before it, sometimes a shovel, sometimes just their body between the sleepers and the night, and every creak, every sigh of the wind, they asked, was that the door, or just the memory of it? The flame flickered, shadows stretched, the rafters groaned, and for a moment just a breath. They saw it, a shape in the corner, a face outside the window, a figure standing at the foot of the bed. They blinked. It was gone. They didn't wake the others, didn't speak of it, because the watcher knew the night played tricks, and sometimes the trick played back. Still they turned the chair to face the shadow, just in case. Everyone knew it. If you were the watcher, you never slept first. You let the house drift into dreams. Let the fire grow dim, let the world go quiet, only then, maybe. If another woke to take your place, you could close your eyes, just for a moment, because if you fell asleep first and something came, no one would be left to see it. And that fear kept your eyes open long after your body begged to rest. It wasn't always a man, sometimes it was the mother. Eyes sunken, hands red from the day's wash. She sat upright near the cradle, blanket over her knees. The firelight lit her cheekbones. Her lips moved in silent counting. Of hours, of heartbeats, of blessings not yet given. She wasn't guarding against wolves or spirits. She was guarding against time. Because time takes children as surely as illness, and she would sit awake, offering every heartbeat of hers to buy just one more for the baby. Not every watcher looked inward. Some stepped outside, faced the star, breathed the cold air, stood with arms crossed as if to hold the world together. They watched the sky for signs. A cloud shaped wrong, a moon too low, a star that flickered like a warning. The sky spoke, they believed, in silence, in symbols, in winds that changed mid-song. And though no one asked what they saw, they always felt different when the watcher returned. They never shared everything, even when asked, even when someone whispered, "Did you hear something last night? Was the door open? Was that a dream or not?" The watcher just nodded, or shrugged, or said, "Nothing important." Because what they saw, what they felt, could not be explained, only endured. They weren't priests or prophets, just people with eyes wide open in a world too full of silence. The watcher didn't sleep, not because they were strong, but because they were needed, because someone had to carry the fear so others could dream. They watched the fire, the door, the dark, the breath of everyone they loved, and they whispered nothing, because their vigil was not for thanks. It was for mourning. And when light came, they smiled, because they had seen the night and not looked away. But sometimes it did. The fire burned low, the shadows grew bold, and the watcher, exhausted, head heavy, hands folded, closed their eyes just for a moment, just one breath too long. The door creaked, the wind whispered, the embers shifted, and no one stirred. Because the watcher, the one who always caught the change, was lost to sleep.
And someone crawled out.